Welcome to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Join us as we dive into the world of endurance sports, exploring everything from nutrition to training and how these elements shape your everyday life, both on and off the race course. Hosted by Coach Justin, certified run and triathlon coach and owner of Tabula Rasa Racing, along with Coach Katie, a registered dietitian specializing in sports nutrition and owner of Fuel to Run. We're here to share insights and real-world advice to help you thrive on your journey. Here at the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast is where your journey begins. Welcome, everyone, to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. I'm your host, Coach Justin. I'm here with Coach Katie. And today we are talking about metabolic efficiency and metabolic flexibility. So this is going to be a two-part series because we're going to approach episode 1 of this series from a nutritional perspective. And then part 2 is going to focus on this same topic, but from a training perspective. So we're going to split this up for you. We're quickly approaching the holidays, and I'm quickly approaching my A race of the year. So I'm not even going to try and attempt to say what episode this is because we've got some episodes in the bank. Both of us are going to try and enjoy the holidays as well with our family and friends. So we're going to just release this out when it gets released, but it will be released during the month of December. So I just wanted to let's do some housekeeping. Thank you guys for tuning in to this week's episode. Wherever you're listening to your podcasts, if you are enjoying the content that's coming out from the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast, please consider leaving a review and comment. They are greatly appreciated and do increase the exposure of the podcast, help others find it as well. And we strongly believed from day one in no sponsors, no monetization of the podcast. We do this out of a labor of love. All of the expenses for hosting and production of the podcast come out of our own pockets. And because of that, we would love to be able to spread the word about the podcast to a broader, wider audience. So your comments and your reviews help accomplish that. And so if you're listening to this on Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever it is, please consider leaving a review and a comment. Also on whatever platform you're using, there is an option to send us a text message. So if you have questions or comments and feedback, feel free to use that as a way to communicate with both Katie and I. We do monitor all communications on a daily basis, so we thank you for participating. We also have the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast group on Facebook, which is a private group on social media. We're trying to grow out the community, so it's a great way to interact with other listeners of the podcast, as well as reach out to us individually. We will be, as we build out this community, this is going to be a great avenue for us to issue out bonus content, supplemental content, try and open up Q&A episodes. So let's try and grow this community together and increase the exposure and allow you to benefit from the podcast even more by being an active participant. Both of us are active coaches. So if you are considering some new adventures into 2026, or if you're just crazy busy and you just want to turn over the reins for your training plan creation, so all you have to do is execute, I hope that you will consider Katie or I as your coach. If you are interested in Katie, you want to see what some of her background is, you can go to fuel2run.com. So Katie is an active running coach as well as dietetics coach. I am at tabularasaracing.com. I do multi-sport and single sport coaching. So we hope that you will consider us as part of your 2026 team to help you in your journey forward. So let's go ahead and we'll get started. We're just going to jump right into this topic.
Sorry, I'm over here. There's a couple of flies still living. I don't know how it's December and they're decided to bug me. So if you see me moving around, it was because I was trying to kill them before they started irritating me. So yeah, let's get started. It sounds
so let's jump into this.
We could jump right
Kate,
in.
Yeah. I'm going to turn the reins over to Katie for the bulk of this episode because it's going to be from a nutrition perspective. So Katie, let's start the introduction. Let's distinguish the difference between metabolic efficiency and metabolic flexibility right off the bat. How are they different?
Right. So the metabolic efficiency is, I think the biggest way to kind of describe this is just improving fat oxidation. So it's kind of basically trying to be able to burn fat more efficiently at slightly higher intensities. So it's just kind of pushing, like we've talked a few times about the crossover concept of like, when we're sort of more at rest, we tend to be burning more fat than carbs. And as we start to exercise, the higher and higher the intensity, the more carb we start to use and less fat. So there's like this kind of crossover where we're burning more carb than fat as the intensity increases. So essentially, being more metabolically efficient means that you're kind of pushing that higher. So at slightly higher intensities, you can still burn more fat. And so that's kind of the predominant thing, when we're focusing on metabolic efficiency. And so we can kind of go through a little bit more about what that means, but let's just kind of compare that to metabolic flexibility a little bit so we can kind of also compare and contrast them as we talk about each. So metabolic flexibility is the ability to burn a little bit more fat at higher intensities, but it's more the ability to like be able to tap into energy sources easily. So being able to, for instance, if you're running really slow, like at zone 2, to be really efficient at burning fat. But then if you decide you want to do a full-on sprint or an interval workout, or you're trying to sprint at the end of the race or go up a hill, and you have to tap into some higher intensity, you're able to easily switch over to burning carbs as fuel. So it's the ability to be flexible with what type of fuel you're using. And so the way they're kind of similar is that a lot of the approaches that people take to improve metabolic efficiency may also help improve flexibility, but they're not exactly the same because efficiency is more related to burning more fat for fuel and being more efficient at that process, where flexibility is kind of being able to use both. But yeah, some of the strategies you might use for one might also benefit the other. So when we're kind of looking at metabolic efficiency, it's important to remember like the reason we would want to do that. Why would we want to be more fat adapted, or why would we want to be able to burn more fat for fuel? And there's basically because it's an unlimited supply in our body, right? We have hundreds, thousands of calories worth of fat just there waiting to be used. And it's a readily, abundant source of fuel, or it could be, where carbohydrate is a little bit limited. So we have maybe 1,500 calories, maybe for some bigger people might be a little more than that, but there is only so much glycogen. So that's about the amount of glycogen we would have stored in our muscles and liver. And that's limited. And then also whatever we eat from the food we're taking in either before or during exercise is also going to be used. And that's the carbs we're getting. And so if somebody is limited maybe in their ability to take in carbs during, or they're doing a really long race where they're going to be running out of glycogen, it could be potentially beneficial to be burning more fat for fuel, because then you maybe need less carb overall. And so we can kind of talk about what types of races this might benefit, because it isn't going to benefit all, every type of race. Like there's certain ones you just wouldn't need to be fat adapted for, because essentially there's a limitation to this. Like you could push that, the ability to burn fat a little bit, but at really high intensities, like say once we get kind of past zone 3 and we're now in zone 4 and zone 5 where we're really pushing it, the need for fuel is so high and the ability to break down fat is just so slow. There's no way the body's going to be able to do that. It's just too slow of a process. And so there's a limitation to this. At some point, at some intensity, you just cannot push that fat adaptation anymore. So if you do want to do something very high intensity, like a 5K, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be fat adapted, because that's not the intensity we're at for that type of race. Isn't, you're just not using fat. You're hardly using any at all in that type of race, or even a mile or anything like, even a 10K is kind of maybe a little bit, but it's mostly going to be glycolytic. So it really wouldn't benefit someone in that type of race, but it might benefit someone in a longer distance event. We can kind of talk about that. So just something to keep in mind, because I think sometimes people kind of are like, oh, I'm going to be more fat adapted, and It's like, well, it may not be like the most beneficial actually, depending on what you're deciding to do and how intense you're going to be running. So, just like I mentioned before, the benefit might be burning fat at slightly higher intensities. You might preserve glycogen, so you could run longer without needing to take in maybe as much fuel, which might be beneficial to somebody who has a lot of gut issues potentially. They just can't take in the carbs that they need to during a race. Maybe there's certain reasons somebody might want to do that. You could potentially delay hitting the wall, that glycogen depleted state that some runners or athletes hit. And then you might be able to sustain potentially also the benefit that you might be able to sustain a certain pace, like marathon pace or potentially like an ultra distance pace at a slightly lower heart rate and lower perceived exertion. Although, I don't know, there's some interesting research and more of the fat adaptations and things that, somebody might do to do this might actually not be that beneficial, but we'll kind of talk into that a little bit. So, I think just some things like to think about if you are more metabolically efficient, the things you might notice, or if you're trying to decide, what does that mean? Like, how would I even know if I'm burning more fat, or I'm becoming better able to burn more fat at slightly higher intensities or just overall more fat adapted? That's hard to say. The only really way to test it in the lab would be to do like an RQ or RER test, which is sometimes associated with when you go to do like a VO2 max test. They'll kind of measure the amount of oxygen consumption and CO2 output, and they're able to kind of maybe measure throughout that intensities, like how much fat to carbs you're able to burn, you're burning. And there's like a kind of a way to measure that. And so you can maybe do something like that, and they can kind of do that, graph it out similar to what I'm talking about with the crossover. So kind of graphing out like when you sort of cross over to burning more carb, and you can kind of do that in the lab. It's expensive. It's not like a cheap test to do. It's not like something you would be able to do probably super often. So it's a few things you could maybe just, be looking at would be if you're marathon pace, like if you're training for a marathon or your longer, your race pace. And again, it's really for probably runners that are or athletes doing anything longer than a marathon, or I would say half Ironman would be sort of the limit for like a triathlete. So, and it's really going to depend. So like a 3-hour marathoner running as fast as they can for 3 hours or 4 hours even, it's questionable whether this is going to be beneficial for that individual because they're still at a higher intensity during that race that they may not even really benefit too much from this. What it would probably be more beneficial for is somebody doing a race that's like 4 or 5, maybe 6 hours or longer, or even longer than that, like an ultra distance. Like even a half Ironman is a little questionable whether this would be super beneficial, just because again, there's going to be some higher intensities during that race. Some people, elites and people training really hard are like pretty much pushing it the whole time. You know what I mean? They're not going at sometimes their heart rate might be more in zone 2, so it kind of depends, but sometimes it's like really in that zone 3 kind of gray zone the whole time. So an Ironman would probably be where this might be beneficial for like a triathlete or doing some of those like really long distance, triathlon events. What do they call? There's one that's like maybe several back to, or it's like much longer than the typical Ironman. There's like, do you know what I'm talking about?
Those
like that.
those ultra, it's like those ultra marathon or ultra Ironman ones where you basically double it, but it's the span over like 2 days. So you take the swim and multiply by 2, the bike multiply by 2, and the run multiply by 2, but it's over the span of 2 days.
2 days, okay.
So
yeah, I think even in something like that where I even think of like people who've attempted to do Ironmans day after day after day for several days in a row, like being potentially more able to burn fat for fuel might be beneficial in that case, because you're not going to be going all out for everyone. Each day it's going to be pretty slow just to get them done and be able to do that day after day after day. So something like extreme like that, it might be beneficial, or probably anything longer than really like a 50-mile trail race, like, or ultra, that may be where it's probably most beneficial to be really fat adapted. So essentially when if you kind of know you're fat adapted, I think there's a few things. If you're doing like a fasted workout or a fasted run, and you can run, and I don't, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the training, but like if you can run, let's say more than like an hour and a half or two, and you don't feel like, and this is at a pretty easy pace, and maybe you still feel pretty good. Like that might be an indication, where if somebody's doing like a pretty easy run and they're getting an hour in and they're like, I'm already depleted. I feel like I need fuel already. That might be a sign, it really depends on how well they ate before and all those factors as well. So it's not always so cut and dry, but like if you wanted to go out and do like a fasted, longish run and you pretty much feel pretty good throughout and you don't feel like you're hitting the wall or running out of fuel or getting tired towards the end, that might be a good sign. If you just feel like, a slightly higher pace, like if you're kind of hitting like marathon pace or you're going a little bit harder and it feels a little bit easier overall, you just feel like it's more aerobic or your heart rate is lower than it was prior when you were doing those types of workouts, maybe that would be an indication. And just like the long runs, just overall, even if you're fueling, just feel a lot easier for the same effort that maybe it didn't feel as easy the last time you trained when you weren't so metabolically efficient. And just maybe even being more resilient or able to kind of at the end, you still feel pretty good. You're doing a long run, long bike, long training session, and you're not fading towards the end. You feel like you're able to stay in it and stay feeling pretty good all the way to the end of the workout. And maybe you're able to get away with fewer gels or, like for the same pace in training or in a race. I don't generally, it's like hard because there might be benefit to taking in fewer gels, like to being able to not fuel, but I also think like, why not, fuel adequately? So, we can talk about that too when we talk about metabolic flexibility, but that's kind of what the benefit would be. And like I said, it really would be in some of those longer duration events. It's really not going to be super beneficial for like shorter duration events. Whereas like metabolic flexibility is kind of a nice adaptation because you can maybe potentially have all of those benefits of feeling more like you can go out and do a fasted run and feel pretty good. But, you can also do a high intensity run and feel pretty good. The problem with metabolic efficiency, if you're truly doing it because there's different ways of doing it. Like I would say most people, when we say metabolically efficient, it's like also associating that with like being more fat adapted. But if you're training your body to be more fat adapted, and you're doing a lot of like, and we'll talk about this a little more, like low carbohydrate eating, like fasted runs, and maybe like even a ketogenic diet in order to achieve that, your body is now very good at burning fat and not very good at burning carb because you're now teaching your body to be fat adapted and be really good fat burner. But you're maybe in that case, if you're truly doing like a keto diet and, that sort of strategy to get there, your body's like, oh, I'm really good at burning fat, but I haven't had carbs in a long time. So it's like when you add carbs to the system, you have to either give your body some time to adapt back to burning carb, or you aren't going to be able to burn that carb very efficiently. So you're very good at being fat adapted, but you're not very good at being able to utilize the carb. So if you don't do it correctly, you get to a race, maybe you have like a hill you want to climb, or you're at the end and you're like winning or something. You want to have that kick at the end. I remember my 50 miler, like I thought the girl was right behind me. So like my last couple of miles of that race, if granted it was downhill, they were like a 6:30 pace. Because I was like, somebody's trying to get me and I don't want them to beat me, But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I'd been completely fat adapted because I wouldn't have been able to tap into that carb zone, carb burning, being able to do that efficiently. So you can't just like be fat adapted and then like last minute sort of all of a sudden add in carbs because the body's going to be like, hey, I haven't really utilized, like the system isn't quite primed to be able to utilize carb as efficiently. So the benefit to being metabolically flexible is that you can kind of go back and forth between the two, and you can be fat adapted or you're able to burn maybe fat slightly higher intensities, but you're also able to like tap into the carb burning system as well pretty readily. So that's kind of where I like metabolic flexibility in that term more than I like the metabolically efficient, like that term. You know what I mean? And some people might kind of put those in one and the same, or I think they kind of get confused. But I think that's a bit, like, hopefully I've kind of talked about the difference between the two, and people kind of understand that now. Like when you're efficient, or you maybe aren't able to tap into carb burning, but when you're flexible, you're able to do both, and you can kind of be able to use both systems of burning fat for fuel and carbs.
Okay, so
Does it make sense?
let's summarize that. And so we can say then you can be metabolically efficient yet be metabolically inflexible. So that is a possibility. Another way of looking at this is, if you are metabolically flexible, does that mean that you are also metabolically efficient?
I think so.
Does it go the other way?
I think for the most part it does, but I just don't know. Like, again, like you might be able to train for flexibility, but not really be able to push the fat burning up, higher. But a lot of the things you do for metabolic efficiency also are things you would do for flexibility. So yes, I think for the most part, as long as you're sort of training these systems, I think the biggest difference is that, in order to maintain the flexibility, you might have to, if somebody is truly doing like a ketogenic or low carb approach, they would have to like have some sort of cyclic approach to it, where they do occasionally cycle in carbs to be able to keep their body, being able to burn carbs. So that's kind of what we're talking about with the diet piece, is kind of what you might do in order to maximize efficiency, but also have flexibility. Because I think that's actually where maybe it's kind of the best of both worlds, is like being able to be metabolically efficient in your ability to burn more fat, but also be flexible and not be just efficient, if that makes sense. So
yes. So a takeaway that I've got from that is that if you follow a ketogenic diet, you may be metabolically efficient, but it might be at the cost of being metabolically flexible.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you lose the ability to effectively utilize carbohydrates, because your body has been starved from carbs, so it's been forced to really train that other system. So
basically, there's like different ways that we break down fat and use fat for fuel, and then there's just, I'm not going to go too much into the weeds of the science behind it, but basically the body will kind of there'll be an up regulation of those pathways and those systems, and then down regulation of the different ways that carbs are used for fuel. Not to say it wouldn't be there at all, but the body's going to be like, okay, I have to switch. I have to I'm on, there's only fat coming in. It's really low carb diet. Like there's some things, especially if someone's on a low carb ketogenic diet for a while, they do adapt to it. But with that, comes this inability to efficiently process carbs. So unless they're strategically adding carbs in here, through a cyclic approach, maybe they become very well fat adapted, but they don't really but then they lose that ability to burn carb. I think there is a study that I will post. In fact, I'll try to find like a few studies on this topic if I can. But there's one researcher, Louise Burke. She did a lot of great research on, they were just elite race walkers, so they weren't runners or triathletes, but they were a good subject, because they're going fast. I mean, if you ever seen these race walkers, like they're walking faster than I could ever walk. So they're actually going at a pretty good pace, and sometimes they're not just in zone 2, like they're it's kind of crazy. So I think we say walkers and people are like, well, if you watch the Olympics and the walking, you would know what I was talking about. It's quite intense. So what they did is they put the one group on a high fat ketogenic diet for a period of time, and then the other, they had like a placebo group, and the high fat diet people were able to utilize fat more readily during their training and during racing, but there was an oxygen, almost like a cost to that. So the high fat diet, because when we break down fat, it requires a little bit more oxygen consumption. And so the cost would be that you would need more oxygen, you'd have to be taking in more oxygen to produce that energy. And it can reduce the exercise economy and potentially impair performance a little bit. So what they were finding was that there really wasn't a huge benefit, if any at all, on these people's performance. So, I think we have to always consider when we're doing something, yes, I think it's great, especially, I think the idea of burning more fat for fuel is awesome. But if your goal is performance, like it is something to consider, like, is this really going to be benefiting my performance? Because it really is. I mean, there's some, there's other studies that maybe show that it might be a benefit, and it's kind of like hit or miss with the research, but there's no like profound benefit to performance, on a fat adapted sort of diet or keto diet. So something to keep in mind too. I think people kind of get lost in the weeds a little bit of like, oh, I want to be able to burn more fat. And, that sounds good because you have so much fat to utilize, but it's not maybe going to benefit performance. So if you want to do it, don't do it for that reason. Is kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But so I don't know if we kind of want to dive then.
Well, let me ask one question for you. Is we've used the example of the cubbies to describe glycogen stores, right? I think this is relevant now because we're talking about the utilization of glycogen over fat. So it kind of dovetails off of it. Does muscle mass or muscle volume have a direct impact on the size of the cubby hole for glycogen? So if you have an endurance athlete and we want to find a way to increase their glycogen stores, which may result in less intake during the event itself, so they have a bigger store to draw from, would it be worthwhile to focus on building more muscle mass?
I mean,
yes.
So the more muscle mass
we can agree
you
that
have,
there's going to be cost to carrying more muscle mass. That's obvious.
Yeah.
But.
I mean, yes, you do have more glycogen, but if you have more muscle, then you're probably burning through that. I don't know. There's probably like like some sort of, you build more muscle, you have more cubby holes, but because you now have more muscle and maybe more weight, depends. Like if you can build more muscle and lose body fat and be the same weight, then yes, that might be beneficial. But because body fat itself doesn't actually do a whole lot for us. I mean, it is a fuel source, but if you have excess body fat, it's not really benefiting you, people generally in any way. So building more, if one way to to build up more glycogen store maybe would be to have more muscle, less body fat, and try not to actually weigh more, because that is going to be something to consider. Yeah. I hope that makes it's hard because there's no real way to, we can carb load. Obviously, there's things that we can do before our races to maximize glycogen. So we can carb load. We can, eat carbs in the morning before our race, make sure it's all topped off before we start, and even maybe a little bit of super compensation there, where there's maybe even the max amount of glycogen you'll ever be able to store is there. So you're ready to go for your race. But I think there's a reason that there's just kind of like this high carb fueling movement, because we realize that there is a limitation for some of these races, to being able to utilize fat for fuel. And the more carb that we can consume during a race, the less likely we're going to run out of glycogen. And there is a physiological thing that happens when our body never actually runs out completely of glycogen. It's always going to have a little bit left. It shuts down. Yeah. So you don't want that to happen, so the more you can delay that, the better. And so that's kind of the preface for the efficiency piece. But I think many people have found that obviously there's a limit to it. Like I said before, you just cannot train your body to burn only fat, at high. No sprinter out there or 5K runner is out there just on their 5K running as fast as they possibly can, burning any substantial amount of fat. It's just not possible. Like, it's not physiologically possible. And so I think that's just something to consider. I think the gray zones are probably anything past that marathon distance, or like we've talked about already, where it's like maybe there's benefit. I'm not sure. Yeah. Any other questions?
So another question that I've got for you is that some endurance athletes, I'll put it this way, the stereotypical endurance athlete is normally a fairly lean individual. So my question to you is it worthwhile then for athletes of that body structure and that body composition to be concerned about metabolic efficiency and metabolic flexibility, because do they necessarily have the excess fat in the system to really burn efficiently, or are they just simply burning through carbs because they have such low body fat percentages.
Yeah, even people who have really lean or low body fat percentages still have enough fat to be able to fuel. Like, that doesn't seem like it because you can look at an individual and be like, oh my gosh, they don't look like they have any fat on their body, right? Some of the Ethiopian, Kenyan runners, you're just like, wow. I mean, they are lean, very small individuals, but they still do, and it's enough potentially, I don't know how many days worth they could go without eating. I don't know, but they still have quite a bit of fat in there. So that's not really the limitation. I don't think it's ever, I mean, obviously there's probably starving people or something where someone's living body fat is very, very low, but even at like 5%, there's still enough fat there to fuel. It's just abundant. Obviously somebody that has more fat or higher fat percentage has a lot more fat, but there's still quite a bit. So that's not really the reason somebody wouldn't do it, wouldn't train metabolic efficiency. Yeah. Do we want to dive into the fueling piece a little bit, and then we can
let's get into that.
Okay. So I'm just having some notes here. I think before we dive into the fueling piece, I did want to mention a few things of when we're sort of training metabolic efficiency and metabolic flexibility, kind of what we're doing, with that, or what the goal would be for that physiologically. So one would be, I think most people kind of know what the mitochondria are. Like, they're the powerhouse of our cells, right? They're the little energy producing, parts of our cell, and they produce, but the more mitochondria we have, the more dense our mitochondria, the more we're going to be better at like fat burning. So that's one thing, is maybe we might be doing things either training wise, and we'll talk about that later, or food fueling wise that might help improve mitochondrial density. So that's a positive thing. Hormonal signaling too can potentially be a benefit. So, insulin, different types of hormones, there might be some modulations there that might benefit us. Potentially, doing certain things that might, like we've already talked about, that might increase our glycogen availability. So we've already kind of mentioned that a little bit. There's enzyme adaptations that can occur that might help us be able to burn more fat or more carb, or switch back and forth more readily. I'm not going to go into the great, like, huge detail on all the different enzymes, just keeping that in mind. That's also happening. Fat oxidation rate, and then the ability to upregulate our utilization of carbohydrate under higher intensities. And so, so that's kind of the metabolic flexibility. So there's like what I'm trying to say here is, when we talk about the different strategies, each one of them kind of works on a different physiological system to improve, so it's not always one thing. It's several things that are kind of happening in the body that might be improving our ability to be more metabolically flexible. And so each thing we might talk about may have a different impact on a different part of the body, if that makes sense. In terms of like knowing you're more metabolically flexible, it's similar to efficiency, but I would say the one thing would be maybe that you're easily able to switch back and forth between paces. Like, we're metabolically efficient, you're just kind of able to really maintain one pace, a pretty steady pace for a long period of time without really needing to fuel a whole lot. Maybe your heart rate's lower. But if you try to like go into a more intense pace, you have a difficulty with that. With the flexibility piece, you're really able to maybe go in and out of higher intensity to lower intensity paces pretty easily without feeling like it's a burden or you're struggling with that. So that might be the big difference there. And some athletes do report slightly lower heartbeat, with some of their higher paces. And there is like a lot of wind. I hope people are hearing that in the background. It's like extremely windy. Hopefully that's not being picked up on the mic, so let's talk about fueling. So let's start with metabolic efficiency, because we already hit on that a little bit. So this would be where somebody might decide to restrict carbs overall. And so like a ketogenic type approach. And I think personally, I'm not a big fan of this, something that like it as a lifestyle sort of situation. I think probably people on a ketogenic diet would dislike me for saying that, because there's unfortunately within diet culture, there's a lot of like religion and dogmatic thinking around diets. And so some people are very much like, attach themselves to this ketogenic diet approach, and they're going to hang on until the bitter end, even if it's meaning that their performance is suffering, or you know what I mean? Like there are people out there like that aren't really willing to see that maybe this isn't the best approach to do like all year long, or never like deviate from. In fact, for athletes, I really don't think being ketogenic is a great approach, but it could be used potentially strategically, to help improve metabolic efficiency and maybe metabolic flexibility. So an example of this maybe would be doing during like the base phase training, when we'll talk about training more, but doing more like of a low carb, when you're just doing mostly like easy mileage, you're just maybe, this is where kind of that, if people follow like I've mentioned Phil Maffetone before, but the kind of, zone 2 training, and he really promotes a lot of I don't know if it's like keto necessarily, but it's kind of like you're in that zone 2, you're doing a lot of like easy mileage, you're doing a lot of volume, maybe something like a low carb approach in that sort of phase would be beneficial. But once you start to get to your training, you've got a race and you're starting the race program, you may want to back off from the keto diet, because I do think that it would probably not benefit you in that sort of training where your intensities are going higher potentially. So it may be beneficial in that sort of situation of very low intensity based training, lots of volume. But once you start to increase the intensity, you may want to either do a cyclic approach. So some athletes will do like 3-4 days of low carb, 3 days of high carb fueling, maybe even like low carb, and then they'll do high carb before like a long run, or I don't know, the way they'll strategically do that so that they're still sort of pushing their body to be fat adapted, but then adding the carbs in to maintain that flexibility. Yeah. That's one way to do it. Or to just become fat adapted and then maybe switch over to, just eating regularly, and then do things throughout the training cycle with your training and or nutrition to maintain that efficiency and without having to stay on a ketogenic diet. So there are some things people can do to sort of maintain that throughout their, training for the race, or their prep for the race, when they're in that phase of their training where they're trying to, optimize their training for a race day. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So that's kind of how I would recommend absolutely. That. Do you have any thoughts or questions on that?
It makes complete sense. And I'm thinking about it from my own perspective, from a very selfish reason, is, I'm a larger athlete, so I am carrying some extra weight, and that's kind of like been one of my goals, is to kind of shed this weight a little bit. So it makes sense that if I want to improve my metabolic efficiency without sacrificing metabolic flexibility, then it makes sense to kind of maybe cycle mm-hmm. these different approaches, to where if I set up my training plan and I have like maybe a few days of fairly easy, base training, where it makes sense to go a little bit lower carb, and then I throw in a couple days of higher intensity, then it makes sense to not try and sustain that lower carb for those days where I'm putting in the higher intensities. Mm-hmm. Rather than sticking with one approach, it makes sense to have that flexibility, and you cycle on and off of these approaches based on your training structure and volume and the goals that you have for a particular event. That makes complete sense.
Yeah, I think it's just like for the periodization discussion we had, I think we can kind of loop that in here, because this is exactly what an example of that, like periodization of, even in a cycle of maybe just being low carb for a while you're in base training, but then within the training cycle, like even like a weekly approach to it of like cyclically, mm-hmm. Having some low carb and high carb days. I think that could be beneficial for sure. Like, I don't have anything against doing some low carb. I think the only thing is you really have to make sure on those days that you're fueling adequately. So if you're trying to lose weight, you still might be wanting to be in a caloric deficit, but you just want to make sure you're not like way under fueling. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more about the risks of doing some of these approaches like later, kind of at the end. But I do think that's one thing to kind of keep in mind, is that you do have to be a little more aware of how to get those calories in. And it's a little harder when we don't have carbs, because that takes a whole bunch of food groups kind of out of the picture. But you do have the, fat is a higher higher energy foods. It's not too hard, but you just have to be a little bit more aware of it. So it's really just like one way to sort of another way to do this would be to like within our training day, so this is something I've done before, a little bit experimented with, because honestly, I really don't love the idea of low carb eating. Like I just don't. I've always toyed with it just because I wanted to see what it was like to be ketogenic for a while and just be like, what is it like? What is this going to feel like? But the thought of not eating carbs, especially because I'm always pretty physically active, it doesn't sit well with me. Plus, I think, for certain individuals, like women too, are kind of a little more sensitive to like low carb. And with my thyroid condition, I just don't know if it's like the best approach for me anyway. So I haven't really ever done like low carb, phase or cyclic low carb where I've done several days or even weeks or months where I've been keto. So I've never actually tried that. It's just not something I feel like is going to work well for me. So you do have to kind of realize like it may not be the best approach for you, but you can try some things within your training, fueling strategies within training to kind of help this a little bit. So one would be to, if you've kind of ever heard like the train high, sleep low strategy, there's a few ones similar to this, but it's like one way to do it is to maybe do an afternoon, evening workout, really, really well fueled. But that workout is like putting you in the well. Like it's like a hard workout. It's like an interval workout or a longer, lactate threshold, something that's really, pushing it. And maybe you're not fueling a whole lot during that workout, if at all, but you're really like depleting glycogen. But you're fueled enough for it that that workout goes well. Like it's a good quality workout and you feel like you nailed it, right? But at the end, you're like, wow, I'm very depleted. Well, then you would eat like a really low carb dinner. Like you would eat enough, you get enough protein so you can get that, benefit of the protein, but you would do no to very little carb in that evening meal. And then you would sleep and you would wake up and have maybe some black coffee, but no fuel. And you would do like a fasted, but not a high intensity, just a fasted, fairly easy to, maybe moderate, but mostly easy run. And it could be, whatever you're comfortable with, 60, 90 minutes. I wouldn't push it too much. I think there's a limitation to where this is beneficial and where it can start to be a little bit dangerous or maybe put you at risk for like poor immune function or getting sick or maybe under fueling. So there's different things that you want to be aware of, but I think that's one way. A way I've done it too is within the same day. So I've done two workouts. So one in the morning, well fueled, finish the workout, then I go low carb for the rest of the day. So this is where I have tried like some low carb, but it's only been within the matter of hours. And it's hard, but I've done a very low carb day and then gone out in the evening and done a second run, very, very low carb. So it's like, and it's interesting because I can't tell, it could be beneficial. I feel like with all my years of running, I'm pretty metabolically efficient. I can tell just because if I do fasted runs, I generally will feel okay. But it was interesting because it felt really weird to go out on that second one after being like very depleted. Like it doesn't feel very good, but I think I did like 60 minutes of pretty easy running. And that's one way I did it. Kind of experimented during my last marathon build. So that's another way to do it. Just kind of within your training, those things you don't want to do all the time either. So I think some people get carried away and they're like, oh my gosh, a little bit of this must be good. I got to do it like every day. I'm going to do this like, like fasted runs or like train, high, like sleep low or whatever, those strategies. And that's really something you want to just put in your training plan strategically. Like even once a week might be too much, like maybe once every other week, depending on the individual, right, and how they're responding and how well they're feeling otherwise and other things going on in their life, because we have to remember this is kind of stressful for the body to be doing this. You don't want to be doing that kind of thing on when you're very stressed, because it does sort of increase the stress on the body. So you want to be strategic about when you do it and kind of the timing of these types of things. But and always remember, we do want to consume protein after our session. So no matter what, we're never ending a session like those low carb days like I was describing. The first thing I did when I got home was have like a high protein drink, low carb like protein drink. I was not limiting my protein intake. Another thing you could do too is maybe just do a high fat meal. Like if you're like, I can't do a fasted run or I can't do a fasted bike ride, to do like a really just high fat meal before. You might, gut wise feel a little bit like uncomfortable, but that's, that's another way to do it. So just kind of going into it very low carb, but maybe not under fueled, if that makes sense. But those are probably the biggest things. I do still remember having, or I still recommend having, like making sure you are practicing your race day fueling on those long runs. So I wouldn't necessarily do a fasted, like for a marathoner, I wouldn't do your 20-mile long run fasted. That's probably not the time I would do that. I would make sure those types of runs are well fueled and you're practicing your race day fueling on those days. It would be more for like a moderate run, if, sometimes people will have like anywhere between like 8 to maybe 14 miles or 15 miles in their schedule on a day just to get some mileage. And it's usually pretty easy, moderate. Like that would be a day to maybe try that. I would not do it on a long run day because that I think will be just too much stress for someone. So don't try to see how far you can go. Oh, I'm going to try to make it 3 hours without eating. Like, I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. So those are just some things. I think kind of covered it. I don't know. I'm trying to think of what else. I'm not looking at my notes too, but
well, it sounds like this approach might be more advisable early on in a training plan. So let's say that you're following, let's say a 16-week plan. Typically, the back half of that plan, so like from week 9 to week 16, like your higher intensity, like race, the specificity phase of a training plan. So maybe weeks 1 through 8, picking certain workouts where you can, go into it in a ketogenic state might be more advisable than picking the back half of a training plan to really kind of go for it, where the intensity is higher. It may seem to kind of sabotage the gains that you're trying to accumulate at that phase of the training cycle. So
yeah, I agree. I think because a lot of times, that back half, you're doing maybe more intensity, more race pace specific work. It probably would not be, I mean, you could still add it in a little bit, but I think it might be one of those things where you have it once a week early on, and like some of these strategies once a week early on. And then as you get closer, maybe once every couple of weeks you do something, or you just kind of do, sometimes what I'll do during that phase is I'll do like one of my easy runs in the morning where it's like 60 minutes. I might do something like that where it's kind of fasted. I don't, where I'm kind of adding a little bit in, but I'm not overly stressing my body. And I still think there might be some benefit to that. But by that point, you really are, it's like you've kind of put the work in, like, you're not going to lose. I don't think, once you're kind of in that, like maybe final 6 to 8 weeks before the race, I don't necessarily think you're going to lose that metabolic flexibility. I think you're kind of there. You've developed it, you're still training quite a bit. So you're still going to maintain it. I wouldn't be fearful like, oh, I'm going to lose this if I don't do this all the time still. So just kind of having by that point, the kind of the faith that you put in the work, and now you're reaping the benefits essentially, because you should be feeling like those marathon pace or those whatever, your pace that you're doing for your, you're trying to hit for your like triathlon, or, you're feeling like that's all just a little bit easier, right? And you're like, okay, I'm kind of reaping the benefits now of all this like hard work of not only training, but also maybe improving your metabolic flexibility. And I don't think you're really going to lose that, during that time frame. So
how do you make the distinction between becoming more physically fit versus becoming more better metabolically efficient? Because if you're training for a marathon and now your marathon paces are starting to feel easier, wouldn't you make the argument that I'm gaining fitness, so I should,
that's true.
It should feel easier as you start to accumulate fitness.
Because you are,
so it's not necessarily I'm becoming more metabolically efficient. I could just becoming more physically fit. I'm gaining fitness. So I think it's a little bit hard to purge out like really what's going on.
It's hard to purge out. It's hard to know, like without doing the testing and stuff. Like it's just hard to know. Like I said before, like I've tried some of these strategies, and I just don't know if it was beneficial, because there wasn't anything where I'm like all of a sudden like, oh wow, it was like some sort of magical thing happened where I'm like, there's a switch I just felt in my body that turned on or something. It doesn't work like that. So These are just, kind of having the faith that, you're doing these things. And I think maybe there's some signs you might notice, like being able to do like the fasted runs more easily, and it doesn't feel like such a hard thing towards the end, especially. But there's not really anything that, yeah, because you're absolutely right. Like, hopefully by the time you get to that phase, you are more fit, right?
Yeah.
So you're maybe just fit. It may have nothing to do with metabolic efficiency or flexibility. So it is hard to parse this out, and there really is no other than the testing I was describing earlier, where you go into a lab, there really is no way to measure this, I don't think. I mean, maybe if you did like a biopsy and they were able to look at the amount of mitochondria you had in your cell or
Yeah.
something, that seems like a lot of work too. Like that
Yeah.
would be expensive. I've never done that. Oh, I had
What?
a biopsy once, but a muscle biopsy, but it was years ago.
Yeah.
I don't really remember.
One question that I have for you is that are there genetic differences that can play a role in metabolic efficiency? So these different approaches that we use, do women react differently to these approaches than men? Are there are there impacts in hormones and menstrual cycles as a result of these different strategies? What are some of the things that listeners should be paying close attention to if they say, I want to go and I want to improve my metabolic efficiency, I want to become more flexible, and if they start to observe some of these things during their training, it might be red flags for them?
I think for both men and women, there can be issues. I think it really comes down to, like what I've already said before, with both men and women just maybe under fueling or not fueling adequately. And so it's a little bit easier to parse that out with females because they're having their menstrual cycle every month. So as soon as somebody stops having that and that's a huge red flag. Women should, that is a sign that something's wrong, right? So we need to make sure that that's not being disrupted. And that can be a signal of like a hormone imbalance. And usually that's related to like underfueling for women. But there's also like, we have to remember, like I said before, like these types of, when their body's starting to run out of glycogen and you're asking it to perform or to continue exercising, that is a really pretty large form of stress on the body to be like in that state of underfueled, like during the run, like, or under inadequate glycogen. And so it might have the response might be like a higher cortisol levels that could arise from that. And so if that's happening once in a while, I think our body, like I said, as long as you're not also really stressed from other things or really fatigued from other things, then it's fine. It could be like a significant problem for people if they're constantly having these like cortisol spikes all the time and from their training. And training itself does, can be stressful, but if we're adding this additional stress. And for women, I think there might be like, because of our sensitive monthly cycle and hormones, I think it could have maybe a more of an impact. Although, I think one thing with men to consider is that it could negatively impact testosterone.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, that is a marker you could test. That's pretty easy for men if you're occasionally going in and getting your testosterone checked and you notice it's really dropping and you're trying to do all this like low carb, fasted running, that could be a sign. Yeah, that's probably maybe a negative thing for that individual. Something bad is kind of happening, maybe not, it's not positive, right? So I think fatigue, if you're doing these strategies and you're just overly fatigued and your performance starts to suffer, that's a huge red flag, right? Like that's not what we want. We want our performance to be good. This is what, we're only doing these things to improve performance in the end, right? So if it's like you're starting to implement things and it's like, this is really making me suffer. My runs aren't feeling good. My workout, my, training rides, whatever it is that they just don't feel good. I'm not able to perform. Like that's probably a good time to be like, maybe I don't need to be doing this. And I think there's potentially, because we don't have a lot of research in women, but I just do think there is potential, even when somebody isn't underfueled, to have some negative reproductive impacts of this just related to the stress of the fasting workout. So there are a lot of people, like Stacy Sims is one. She's like a researcher that does a lot with women training and just athletes, and she just really does not recommend fasted workouts for women. So I think women, maybe need to have a little bit more caution with this than men, but I do think for both, it's not always going to be positive. And there could be other like muscle breakdown if you're not getting enough protein and maybe bone issues.
Right.
It's, there's not like this is the magic thing, and I think one thing to just emphasize again is it's like you do some of these strategies with the eating around the exercise and the food piece. You do some of this occasionally. It's not like, I think a lot of people are like, oh, like I'm going to implement this, 3 times a week. And that, that is not a good idea. A little bit is good. A lot is not good. Just like a lot of things,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I guess so it sounds like one of the red flags could be sleep quality. So if you start to have, spikes in cortisol, then really that is highly correlated with quality sleep. So if you start this implementation of trying to build or increase your metabolic efficiency and flexibility, and you start to experience disruptions in sleep, it may not necessarily be from the training volume that you've got. It's this new strategy on where you're trying to stress the body additionally on top of the training by restricting carbohydrate in order to spur economic or metabolic efficiency. It might be a good time then to cycle off of that approach, give the body a chance to recover, get the cortisol levels down, and then maybe cycle back on. So this is another argument for this cyclic approach to building metabolic efficiency and flexibility.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great point. So there's like, sleep. If your sleep is suffering, if your performance is suffering, if, your just ability to cope with life is, suffering, then we want to, for women, like menstrual cycle issues, like those are all signs for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things we want to be paying attention to, right? Any point, even other things can cause that. So just things to kind of keep in mind and be looking out for as red flags, I think are good. Do we want to like kind of switch gears or kind of end it there and then focus a little bit more on the training side?
Do we have any more pieces to the nutrition side of it?
Not really. I mean, I think when we're talking about training, there might be some things I'll mention and reiterate that we've already talked about. But let's kind of like...
Yeah, let's cap this off.
Cap this off, yeah.
Yep. So this has been our first of 2 episodes on metabolic efficiency and metabolic flexibility. We've approached this from a nutrition aspect. And so the next logical step is, how do we incorporate this and how do we build this flexibility and efficiency through our training? So that's going to be the next episode, part 2 of this series. So we want to thank you guys for tuning into this episode. Thank you so much. We greatly appreciate your support of the podcast. Again, if you enjoy this content and you would like to support the podcast, please consider just leaving a review and a comment, whether that be on YouTube or any of the platforms that you consume your podcast from. I'm Coach Justin, along with Coach Katie. We're going to thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Feel free to leave us up to a 5-star review on iTunes and Spotify, because leaving a review really helps others like you find us. Visit the podcast website for other episodes of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast at enduranceathletejourney.buzzsprout.com. Have questions or comments about the podcast? Send Coach Justin and Kate an email at theenduranceathletejourney@gmail.com. For all things coaching, visit Coach Katie at fuel2run.com and Coach Justin at tabularasaracing.com. Again, thank you for listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast, and remember to find joy in the journey.